Close your eyes. Imagine receiving a message from a stranger. It comes through WhatsApp or Telegram or a dating app or simply as a text to a number that was perhaps misdialed. The message is friendly, a little uncertain, an apology for contacting you out of the blue, a small joke, an opening that feels natural and warm. The person on the other end is articulate and interesting. They have a life that sounds appealing, a profession in finance or trading, an apartment in a city you recognize, a personality that emerges across days and weeks of conversation as thoughtful and curious and genuinely engaged with you in particular. They ask about your life. They remember the details you share. They build, slowly and patiently, the architecture of what feels like a real friendship, and then something more. Weeks or months pass. The relationship has become something you think about. And then, almost casually, your new friend mentions that they have been making extraordinary returns in cryptocurrency trading. They have found a platform, they say, a private exchange, an exclusive arrangement where the returns are truly remarkable. They have made significant money. They want, because they care about you, to share the opportunity. This is the beginning of what law enforcement agencies around the world now call pig butchering. The name comes from a Chinese phrase, shaju pan, literally pig slaughter plate, and it describes what happens with a precision that its victims, in the moment, cannot see. You are the pig, and you are being fattened before you are killed. The fattening takes months. The relationship is the feed. The cryptocurrency platform is the mechanism of slaughter, and behind it, in a network of fortified compounds scattered across Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and the Philippines, are the operators, thousands of them, who are running this fraud at an industrial scale that has become one of the largest financial crimes in human history. The numbers, when you encounter them, resist easy comprehension. The FBI estimates that pig butchering scams cost American victims alone more than $3 billion in 2023. Global estimates, accounting for victims in Europe, Asia, Australia, and across the developing world, suggest the total losses may exceed $10 billion annually. Some researchers believe these figures are significant undercounts, that the majority of victims never report to law enforcement for reasons of shame, disbelief, or simply because they do not know that a crime has been committed, rather than merely a catastrophic personal failure. The Global Anti-Scam Organization, a nonprofit founded by victims, has documented individual losses ranging from tens of thousands of dollars to several million. A retired teacher in Ohio lost her life savings of $400,000. A software engineer in Singapore lost $1.2 million. A physician in Canada lost everything she had invested over 30 years of practice, plus significant sums borrowed from family who did not understand what they were funding. These are not gullible people in any ordinary sense. The victims of pig butchering tend, in the data, to be educated, employed, financially literate adults. People who, in other contexts, would be described as careful and sophisticated. This is not a coincidence. The scam is deliberately designed to defeat the defenses that educated people believe protect them. It is patient, technically sophisticated, and psychologically precise in ways that most people, encountering it for the first time, are entirely unprepared for. What makes pig butchering unusually dangerous is its exploitation of conditions that are deeply common and deeply human. The scam does not require its targets to be naive about money or technology. It requires only that they be, at some point in the weeks or months of contact, experiencing a kind of openness, a willingness to let something new into their lives. Researchers who have studied the victim population have noted recurring circumstances: a recent divorce or breakup, a period of professional transition, the death of someone close, a relocation to a new city where the social network has not yet been rebuilt. These are not weaknesses. They are the ordinary conditions of ordinary life. The scam did not find exceptionally vulnerable people. It found people who were, in a moment that felt private and unremarkable, available for connection. The psychological sophistication of the operators extends to their understanding of how commitment escalates. Behavioral economists have documented a principle called the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency of people to continue investing in something because of what they have already invested, even when the rational assessment would suggest stopping. Pig butchering activates this mechanism with precision. Every deposit that appears to grow, every successful small withdrawal that confirms the system functions, every week of relationship that deepens the personal bond, all of it becomes a form of prior investment that makes the next request feel like the necessary continuation of something already begun, rather than a new decision to be evaluated freshly. By the time the large withdrawals are requested, the target is not making a decision about whether to trust a stranger. They are making a decision about whether to abandon a relationship and an investment that has cost them months of their emotional life. That is a far harder decision to make, and the operators know it. This is the story of how pig butchering works, where it came from, who runs it, and who is trapped inside it. Because the story of this fraud is not only a story about victims who lost their money, it is also a story about another category of victim entirely. The people who were brought to the compounds under false pretenses, trapped there by violence and debt, and forced to run the scams against their will. The operational structure of a pig butchering scam is elaborate in ways that distinguish it from earlier forms of internet fraud. Traditional online scams, the Nigerian prince email, the lottery notification, the urgent request from a stranded traveler, relied on volume and simplicity. Send 1 million messages. Extract money from a fraction of a percent. The signals that something was wrong were present almost immediately. The grammar was poor, the story was implausible, the urgency was suspicious. The scams worked because they reached enough people, not because they were convincing to any individual one. Pig butchering inverted this model entirely. It substituted depth for breadth. Rather than sending millions of crude messages, it sent targeted messages to smaller numbers of carefully selected potential victims, and then invested weeks or months of sustained, skilled, personalized attention in each one. The time investment is the key innovation. It takes patience to build a relationship that feels real. It takes skill to maintain it across dozens of conversations without contradicting yourself, without triggering suspicion, without moving too fast. The scam operators discovered that the return on this investment, the amount extracted from a single victim who has been properly cultivated, was orders of magnitude higher than anything achievable through mass volume alone. One dimension of this vulnerability that researchers have documented with particular care is the role of loneliness as a structural precondition rather than a personal failing. Social isolation statistics in the United States and Europe suggest that the populations most vulnerable to sustained, high-investment relationship fraud are precisely the populations that have grown in recent decades. People living alone, people in new cities, people navigating life transitions in the absence of dense social networks. The pig butchering operators did not create this vulnerability. They found it, mapped it, and built a product precisely calibrated to fill it. The relationship is not an illusion designed to overcome resistance to a financial pitch. The financial pitch is the extraction mechanism attached to a relationship that is, in many genuine respects, real. Real attention, real responsiveness, real investment of time and skill. The tragedy is not simply that money was taken. It is that something that felt like connection turned out to be its weaponized shadow. The scam proceeds in phases that have been documented and named by researchers who have studied it. The first phase is contact, an initial message that appears accidental or serendipitous, establishing a plausible reason for the conversation. The most common pretexts are wrong numbers, sending a message to someone one digit off from an intended recipient, misidentified contacts, mistaking someone for a person they don't know, and dating app matches where the opener feels casual rather than scripted. The message is always low stakes. There is no ask, no pitch, nothing that would trigger the reflexive suspicion that any direct approach to a stranger would generate. The second phase, which can last anywhere from 2 weeks to several months, is cultivation. The scam operator, or in well-resourced operations, a team of operators sharing a single persona across rotating shifts, builds the relationship through sustained conversation. They study their target's social media presence, learning their interests, their history, their family situation, their financial circumstances. They tailor their persona accordingly. A target who has mentioned travel gets a persona who has been to the same places. A target interested in literature encounters someone who has read the same books. The conversations are compellingly engaging because they are designed by people whose only job, for 8 to 12 hours a day, is to make them so. The third phase is introduction of the investment theme. This never happens abruptly. It emerges naturally from the relationship, mentioned casually in passing, then dropped, then returned to again as something the operator is visibly enthusiastic about, but not pushing. The investment platform is described as exclusive, invitation only, something the target is fortunate to be told about. The returns are framed as the result of the operator's genuine skill and special access, not as something available to everyone. The target is positioned as lucky, special, trusted. The fourth phase is the investment itself, which proceeds in stages specifically designed to build confidence before extracting significant sums. The target is encouraged to create an account on a platform that looks legitimate, professionally designed with working charts and interfaces and customer service channels. A small initial deposit is made. It appears to grow rapidly. The target is able to withdraw small amounts to confirm the system works, a key feature that distinguishes pig butchering from simple investment fraud. The confidence built by these early successful withdrawals is what enables the fifth phase, the escalation to large deposits that will never be seen again. The platforms themselves are counterfeit in an extraordinarily sophisticated way. They are not crude fakes that a careful examination would expose. They mimic legitimate cryptocurrency exchanges with interfaces that are nearly indistinguishable from the real thing, with fake trading data that moves in plausible patterns, with account statements that show genuine-seeming transaction histories. When targets check their balances, they see numbers that appear to be growing. When they attempt to withdraw, they are often told they can, but first must pay a tax, or a fee, or a compliance charge, or a verification deposit. Each new fee is designed to extract more money from targets who believe they are on the verge of recovering enormous profits. The final extraction often exceeds the initial investment by multiples, because the target has become desperate to unlock the funds they believe they have legitimately earned. The operators know, from experience, exactly when a target is exhausted. They know when the next request for funds will simply cause the person to stop responding. At that point, the relationship ends as abruptly as it began. The persona goes silent. The platform becomes inaccessible. The money is gone. The emotional aftermath for targets is often as damaging as the financial one, and in some respects harder to process. Losing money to a bad investment or a stock market crash is a recognizable misfortune. What happened in a pig butchering scam includes months of genuine feeling intimacy, conversations that were tender and funny and engaging, a person who remembered things about you, who asked follow-up questions, who seemed to care about your life. The revelation that this relationship was constructed, that the person who remembered your mother's birthday and laughed at your jokes was performing a role while reading from a template, is not simply disappointing. It dismantles something. Many victims describe a period of disorientation that is distinct from and in addition to the financial crisis, a difficulty trusting new connections, a retroactive suspicion of memories that had been real and warm, a shame that attaches not to having been tricked, but to having wanted something that turned out not to be real. Law enforcement and mental health researchers who work with victims have noted that shame is, in many cases, the primary barrier to reporting. The standard fraud narrative involves a victim being deceived about a transaction. Pig butchering involves a victim being deceived about a relationship and the shame of having been in a relationship that wasn't real, of having confided in someone who wasn't there, is qualitatively different from ordinary financial shame. It is more intimate. It is more likely to be hidden from family and friends who would be confused by the mix of financial loss and emotional grief. And it is more likely to go unaddressed, which means law enforcement statistics substantially undercount the scale of what is happening. Where does a fraud operation of this scale run from? For the first generation of phone and email scammers, the answer was simple: anywhere with an internet connection. Pig butchering, with its need for teams of skilled operators, specialized technical infrastructure, and protection from law enforcement, required a different kind of geography. The answer was found in the borderlands of Southeast Asia, specifically in the special economic zones and ungoverned territories that exist in the friction between Myanmar's collapsing central authority, Cambodia's permissive regulatory environment, Laos's remote northern regions, and the southern Philippines. These areas had, through a combination of political dysfunction, active corruption of local officials, and the deliberate investment of organized crime groups with enormous capital, become territories where conventional law enforcement could not effectively operate. They were close enough to major population centers to receive supply chains and telecommunications infrastructure, and remote enough from effective oversight to operate essentially openly. The compounds are physical structures, walled complexes that from the outside resemble gated communities or industrial parks. Inside, they are organized around the operational requirements of large-scale fraud. There are floors divided into workstations, each equipped with multiple phones and laptops. There are dormitories where workers eat and sleep under varying degrees of restriction. There are management hierarchies that run the operations, set quotas, monitor performance, and discipline underperformers. There are technical teams that build and maintain the fraudulent platforms. There are financial teams that move money through cryptocurrency wallets, mixers, and withdrawal channels designed to frustrate tracing. The physical design of the compounds reflects both the operational requirements of large-scale fraud and the logic of containment. Satellite imagery and testimony from former workers describe perimeter walls topped with razor wire, CCTV networks covering all interior common areas, and controlled exit points staffed at all hours. Some compounds had guard forces that were explicit about their function, preventing departure. Others maintained the fiction of an open environment while ensuring, through confiscated documents, controlled communications, and debt structures that made departure economically ruinous, that the effective constraint was total. The combination of physical and economic control meant that escape required not just the physical capacity to leave, but the financial capacity to survive outside and the legal capacity to cross borders without documentation. For most workers, at least one of these conditions was absent. The early compounds were operated primarily by Chinese organized crime networks that had relocated from Macau and other gambling jurisdictions under pressure from Beijing's 2019 crackdown on cross-border gambling operations. These networks had capital, organizational expertise, and connections to the corrupt local officials whose cooperation was necessary to operate openly. They brought with them a workforce initially recruited from China. Young people promised legitimate jobs in customer service, translation, or technology, who found on arrival that their documents had been confiscated and their situation was not what they had been told. This is the detail that transforms pig butchering from a story about financial fraud into something considerably darker. A significant portion of the people running these scams are themselves victims. They were trafficked. The geographic distribution of compound operations reflects the deliberate logic of criminal geography. Myanmar's Shan State and the Karen border regions offer the greatest operational freedom. The post-coup military government has neither the capacity nor the consistent will to police territories controlled by ethnic armed organizations that have, in several documented cases, entered into revenue-sharing arrangements with the compound operators. The Kokang Special Region and the Wa State, formerly autonomous territories that China has historically kept at arm's length rather than absorbed, function as nearly extraterritorial zones where neither Myanmar law nor Chinese law effectively applies. The Karen National Union, one of the ethnic resistance forces fighting the military junta, has acknowledged the existence of scam operations in areas it controls and has taken some steps to address them under international pressure, while critics note that the economic activity generated by the compounds represents significant revenue that is difficult to abandon. Cambodia's coastal and border regions offered a different attraction. A nominally functioning government that proved willing to look away in exchange for investment that took forms the official economy could describe as legitimate. Sihanoukville, a port city that Chinese investment transformed between 2016 and 2019 from a backwater into a construction site, became the center of a casino and online gambling economy before Beijing's 2019 crackdown displaced those operations and the compound model filled the vacuum they left. The Cambodian government's eventual raids on Sihanoukville compounds in 2022 and 2023, conducted partly in response to sustained international pressure and partly because the political cost of the trafficking stories had become unmanageable, displaced but did not eliminate the operations. Many moved north to the Poipet border region or across into Myanmar. What all these locations share is the same essential architecture of impunity, a combination of political dysfunction, corrupt local officials whose cooperation is available for the right price, and sufficient geographic or jurisdictional distance from the nearest effective law enforcement authority to allow operations to run openly for months or years before any meaningful disruption occurs. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimated in a 2023 report that more than 200,000 people may be held in scam compounds across Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and the Philippines. Other estimates run higher. The International Justice Mission, which has worked on trafficking cases connected to these operations, documented cases from more than 50 countries of origin. People recruited from Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, India, the Philippines, and increasingly from Africa and Latin America. The recruitment follows a template. Job advertisements appear on legitimate platforms, LinkedIn, Facebook, Indeed, offering well-paying positions in customer service, translation, IT support, or hospitality in Southeast Asian cities. The salaries are attractive, sometimes 2 or 3 times what the advertised positions would pay domestically. The job descriptions are vague enough to avoid particular scrutiny, but precise enough to seem credible. References and documentation appear professional. The recruited workers fly to Bangkok or Phnom Penh or Yangon with legitimate tickets and visas. They are met at the airport by handlers who seem initially friendly and professional. They are transported by car, then boat, then car again, to locations that become progressively more remote. At some point, often at a border crossing or a checkpoint staffed by people who are clearly cooperating with the transport operation. The recruits' passports are taken. By the time they arrive at the compound, they are in possession of no documents, no money, and no means of communication that hasn't been monitored or replaced with a device that is. The moment of arrival frequently involves a staged reveal of the actual conditions that strips away the last residue of misapprehension. Workers who had been told they were entering customer service or technology roles were shown the workstations, rows of phones and laptops, scripts and persona management tools, targets already queued in messaging apps waiting for the day's first contact. Some compounds conducted what former workers described as orientation sessions, presentations explaining the scam model, the quota structure, the payment arrangement for meeting targets, and the penalty structure for missing them. The matter-of-fact presentation of criminal work as simply the terms of employment was itself a form of psychological coercion. Here is the reality. The question of whether you consent has already been decided by the circumstances. Escape accounts collected by investigative journalists and NGO researchers describe the same recurring elements: a period of calculating the odds, watching other workers, identifying which guards were more relaxed or potentially corruptible, trying to maintain communication with family members through channels the compound operators hadn't fully monitored. The families of trapped workers receiving irregular and obviously monitored messages often attempted their own interventions, contacting embassies, filing missing persons reports, paying intermediaries who claimed to be able to arrange release. Some of these intermediaries were genuine. Many were additional extraction vectors, collecting fees from desperate families with no actual capacity or intention to secure anyone's freedom. The rescue of workers from compounds has, in documented cases, required the cooperation of embassy officials, local law enforcement officials who were not complicit in the operation, border crossing personnel, and sometimes the covert involvement of rival criminal organizations willing to facilitate an exit in exchange for information about competitors. Inside the compounds, the workers are assigned to scam teams and trained in the distinct techniques their operation uses. They are given scripts for initial contact messages, tools for researching targets on social media, frameworks for building relationships and introducing the investment theme. They are given personas, typically presenting as attractive, successful young professionals from Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Singapore, with elaborate backstories, stock photographs sourced from social media accounts, and communication styles calibrated for their target demographics. The workers are told, in some operations, that they must pay off a recruitment fee, often $5,000 to $10,000, before they can leave, and that this fee increases if they fail to meet performance quotas. This debt bondage mechanism ensures that even workers who arrived voluntarily remain trapped through financial calculation, if not through direct physical coercion. In operations that use more direct violence, workers who attempt to escape or who consistently underperform are beaten, sold to other compound operators, or simply held indefinitely. Accounts from workers who were eventually rescued or who managed to escape describe electric shocks, deprivation of food and water, and surveillance that was total within the compound perimeter. Some workers became effective at the job, and some of those stayed voluntarily once their initial debt was repaid, having found in the scam trade a form of employment that paid significantly more than anything available to them at home. This complexity, the spectrum between forced labor and economic pragmatism, has made the legal and moral accounting of the compounds genuinely difficult. Not everyone inside was a slave. Not everyone was truly free. The range of circumstances across hundreds of thousands of people scattered across dozens of compounds in multiple countries defies any single characterization. The training process inside the compounds reveals how systematized the fraud operation had become by the time investigators began documenting it. Rescued workers described receiving instruction materials, printed booklets, and digital documents that covered everything from how to initiate contact without triggering suspicion to the precise psychological timing of when to introduce the investment theme. These materials were regularly updated, incorporating feedback from what had worked and what hadn't across thousands of actual conversations. The scripts were not crude. They were refined instruments developed over years of adversarial iteration against the cumulative experience of millions of targets. Workers were evaluated on metrics that would be familiar in any call center: contact conversion rates, the average time from first message to first deposit, the average total extracted per target before the relationship ended. High performers were rewarded with better dormitory conditions, more phone allocation, and reduced debt quotas. Underperformers faced the reverse: increased debt, worse conditions, and in operations that relied more heavily on coercion, physical consequences that escalated in severity with the magnitude of the underperformance. Several compounds operated explicit price lists for punishments. Concrete acts of violence assigned targeted costs in debt added to the worker's ledger, so that the cost of non-compliance was always both physical and financial. The cultural dimension of the operation was one of its underappreciated complexities. Early compounds primarily targeted Chinese-speaking victims because the operators, largely from mainland China and with cultural fluency in that market, could run the relationship building effectively. As the model was adapted for Western markets, the need for English language proficiency created a recruitment premium that drove operators to seek workers from Africa and South Asia, regions with higher rates of English fluency, but also, not coincidentally, higher economic precarity that made the fraudulent job advertisements more attractive. This expansion of the trafficking supply chain into new source countries reflected the operational sophistication of organizations that were, in structure if not in legal form, genuine multinationals with human resources challenges. The proceeds of pig butchering don't sit in accounts waiting to be traced. They move, almost immediately, through a sequence of transactions designed to break the connection between the fraud and the eventual withdrawal of value. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are the preferred vehicle in the first stage because they can be moved instantly across borders without any bank or financial institution as an intermediary. A victim in Ohio sends funds to a wallet address displayed by the fraudulent platform. Those funds move within minutes or hours to a different wallet, then to another, then through a cryptocurrency mixing service, a protocol that pools transactions from multiple sources to obscure their origins, then to yet another wallet, often in a different currency. The chain of transactions may involve a dozen intermediate wallets before the funds reach a point where they can be exchanged for fiat currency through an exchange or broker that operates in a jurisdiction with minimal compliance requirements. The sophistication of the money movement operation is, in some respects, greater than the sophistication of the fraud itself. The people designing these flows have deep knowledge of blockchain analytics capabilities, the tools that law enforcement uses to trace cryptocurrency transactions, and deliberately construct transaction chains that defeat them. They use mixers that are several steps ahead of regulatory frameworks, exchanges in jurisdictions that do not cooperate with international law enforcement requests, and over-the-counter brokers who convert large quantities of cryptocurrency to cash with minimal documentation. A significant portion of the proceeds flows through Tether, the USDT stablecoin, because Tether's price stability makes it practical for storing value between transactions, and because the Tron blockchain, on which much of the fraudulent Tether flows, with its low fees and fast transactions, has become a preferred infrastructure layer for criminal money movement. In 2023, the United Nations reported that Tether on Tron had become the dominant currency of choice for pig butchering proceeds across Southeast Asia. Tether's issuer, Tether Holdings, has cooperated with law enforcement on some freezing requests, and the Tron Foundation has established compliance frameworks that are more responsive than they once were. But the scale of the fraud so vastly exceeds the capacity of these cooperative mechanisms that the impact on actual money flows has been modest at best. The velocity of money movement through these systems is striking. Blockchain analytics researchers who have traced pig butchering proceeds have documented cases in which funds moved from a victim's bank account through a cryptocurrency exchange into a wallet cluster associated with a known fraud operation, through 3 or 4 intermediate wallets, into a mixing service, and out the other side as a different currency, all within a window of 4 to 6 hours. The speed is not accidental. It is designed to create a temporal gap between the moment a victim realizes they have been defrauded and the moment any freeze request could be processed and executed. By the time a victim contacts law enforcement, contacts their bank, and the bank contacts the cryptocurrency exchange, the funds have moved through enough intermediate steps that any freeze order addresses an empty wallet. Chainalysis, the blockchain analytics firm that provides tracing services to many law enforcement agencies, published an analysis in 2023 estimating that pig butchering operations had generated at least $75 billion in traceable on-chain proceeds in the preceding several years. The actual figure is almost certainly higher because the analysis could only capture transactions visible on public blockchains. An unknown but substantial additional volume moved through private systems and off-chain arrangements that cannot be traced through blockchain analysis alone. The addresses associated with the largest pig butchering operations receive more funds than some mid-sized cryptocurrency exchanges, a scale that makes them not merely criminal enterprises, but significant participants in the global cryptocurrency economy. The over-the-counter brokers who convert the final cryptocurrency proceeds into fiat currency represent a layer of the operation that has proven particularly difficult to address. These brokers, often operating as informal money service businesses in jurisdictions with minimal regulatory oversight, provide the essential bridge between the cryptocurrency economy and the conventional financial system. Without them, the proceeds would be difficult to spend. With them, large quantities of cryptocurrency can be converted to cash, wire transfers, or trade goods with minimal documentation and at prices that reflect a modest discount for the discretion. Addressing this layer requires cooperation from jurisdictions that have, in many cases, structured their financial regulatory environment precisely to attract this kind of business. Law enforcement's response to pig butchering has been slow, under-resourced, and complicated by jurisdictional fragmentation that the operators deliberately exploit. A fraud that begins with a message sent from a compound in Myanmar, targets a victim in Texas, routes money through a fake platform registered in Vanuatu, and withdraws proceeds through an exchange in Dubai involves at least 4 sovereign jurisdictions, none of which has primary authority or, in most cases, the full picture needed to prosecute anyone involved. Before examining what law enforcement has managed to accomplish, it is worth understanding the scale of what it is attempting. Pig butchering is not a category of crime that produces a manageable number of cases with identifiable perpetrators and recoverable evidence chains. It is an ecosystem, tens of thousands of simultaneous ongoing frauds conducted from dozens of compounds across multiple jurisdictions by hundreds of thousands of operators against victims on every inhabited continent, with proceeds moving through financial infrastructure that operates at computational speed across systems that span a dozen sovereign jurisdictions. The entire formal apparatus of international law enforcement, every agent, every mutual legal assistance treaty, every coordination mechanism that exists, was not designed for a problem of this architecture. It was designed for crimes that happen in places at times, with perpetrators who can be named and arrested. Pig butchering is more like a weather system, a sustained environmental condition with a structural cause, not a discrete event with a discrete perpetrator. American law enforcement, the FBI, the Secret Service, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, has the most resources dedicated to pig butchering investigation and the largest victim population within its jurisdiction. The FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center has documented the rapid rise of these scams across its annual reporting and has issued public warnings that have reached millions of people. The Bureau has made arrests in a number of cases, typically targeting money mule networks in the United States through whom extracted funds pass on their way to the compounds. These arrests address the margins of the operation rather than its core. Interpol and regional law enforcement bodies have conducted several high-profile operations targeting particular compounds. In 2023, a coordinated operation involving agencies from Myanmar, Thailand, China, and Laos disrupted several major compounds along the Thai-Myanmar border, arresting hundreds of workers, many of whom were themselves trafficking victims, and dismantling operations that were responsible for a measurable fraction of global pig butchering activity. Similar operations in Cambodia led to the raid of several compounds in Sihanoukville, a coastal city that had become a hub of Chinese-operated fraud. But the operators proved capable of rapid reconstitution. Compounds that were raided moved their operations to new facilities in regions with less law enforcement pressure. The organizational networks that controlled the operations, the Chinese crime syndicates, and the local political figures whose cooperation made everything possible, were rarely touched. The people arrested were, in the main, operators and workers rather than principals. The challenge facing law enforcement is structural rather than merely tactical. Pig butchering thrives in the space between jurisdictions, in the gap between the speed of cryptocurrency transactions and the pace of international legal cooperation, and in the economic and political conditions of post-coup Myanmar and opportunistic Cambodia that make these territories effectively open to any criminal enterprise with enough capital to pay the necessary bribes. Until those conditions change, until the political circumstances that make safe operation in these regions possible are addressed, law enforcement successes, however celebrated in the moment, will not significantly change the global trajectory of the problem. The deliberate legal obstacles that international law enforcement faces in pig butchering cases illustrate why the problem has proved so durable. Mutual legal assistance treaties, the international agreements that govern how one country's law enforcement can request cooperation from another, were designed for an era of slower crime, where the evidence needed to investigate a fraud was held by a manageable number of institutions in a manageable number of countries. A pig butchering case might involve communication platforms based in the United States, cryptocurrency exchanges registered in the Seychelles, payment processors operating through Hong Kong, victim bank accounts in Germany and Brazil, and fraud platforms whose registration traces to shell companies in Vanuatu and the Marshall Islands. Each piece of evidence requires a separate legal assistance request to a separate jurisdiction, each processed at the pace of bilateral diplomatic relations rather than the pace of the investigation. By the time the legal architecture for a prosecution is assembled, the operation has reconstituted itself and the evidence is stale. The United States has attempted to address part of this problem through aggressive money laundering prosecutions, targeting the financial infrastructure in the United States that handles fraud proceeds. Several large cryptocurrency exchanges have faced enforcement actions related to insufficient anti-money laundering controls that allowed pig butchering money to pass through their systems. These cases established important precedents about exchange liability, but the deterrent effect on the overall system has been modest. The operations most directly responsible for the fraud run from jurisdictions where United States Enforcement Authority does not reach, and the American nexus defendants, the money mules, the domestic exchange accounts through which proceeds briefly passed, are peripheral actors whose prosecution, while just, does not disrupt the principles. Against this landscape, individual victims have built something that law enforcement could not. A global community of people who share information, support each other, and work systematically to document the scams, identify the patterns, and warn those who might still be saved. The Global Anti-Scam Organization was founded in 2021 by a Singaporean woman who had lost more than $80,000 to a pig butchering scam and, in her research into what had happened to her, discovered the scale of the phenomenon and the absence of any organized response. GASO now has volunteers in dozens of countries, maintains a database of fraudulent platforms and phone numbers, operates a hotline through which potential victims can verify whether a platform they have been directed to is on the fraud list, and has provided evidence to law enforcement investigations across multiple jurisdictions. The organization's most valuable work may be its real-time intervention, reaching people mid-scam before they have transferred everything, and providing them with evidence detailed enough to break through the psychological commitment that the months of relationship building have created. Telling someone that their new friend is a scammer is not enough. They will not believe it. Showing them the particular platform URL they have been sent, matched against a database of known fraud platforms, and the clear script patterns their conversations have followed, matched against documented templates. This specificity has sometimes been enough to reach people who would otherwise have been unreachable. Other organizations have emerged from different angles. The International Justice Mission has pursued cases focused on the trafficking dimension, working with survivors to document the conditions inside distinct compounds and connecting these accounts to legal frameworks around human trafficking and forced labor. Several class action lawsuits have been filed in U.S. courts targeting cryptocurrency exchanges and payment processors alleged to have facilitated the movement of fraud proceeds, arguing that their compliance failures amounted to complicity. These cases have had mixed success in American courts, where the legal questions around platform liability for cryptocurrency transactions are still being established. And there is a growing body of research, from academic criminologists, security firms, intelligence consultancies, and investigative journalists, that has documented the pig butchering ecosystem with increasing granularity. The researchers at companies like Chainalysis and Elliptic, who specialize in blockchain transaction analysis, have traced billions of dollars of fraud proceeds to precise wallet clusters, and have published detailed analyses of the money flow architecture. This research is being used by law enforcement even where its direct translation into prosecutions has been slow. The investigative journalism dimension of this response has been important in ways that formal law enforcement cannot replicate. Reporters embedded in the borderland regions, working through local fixer networks, conducting interviews with escaped workers, crossing checkpoints, and navigating the informal economies of these frontier zones, have produced documentation of the compound's internal organization that would have required years of law enforcement investigation to assemble through official channels. Publications including Reuters, the BBC, and a network of local Southeast Asian media organizations have run sustained investigation series that have directly influenced diplomatic conversations, informed parliamentary inquiries in multiple countries, and provided material that NGOs have used in advocacy campaigns. The Survivor-to-Survivor support network is perhaps the most underappreciated element of the civil response. Groups that began as informal online communities, people who found each other in the aftermath of a shared experience and started comparing notes, have developed into structured organizations with real institutional capacity. These communities maintain up-to-date databases of fraudulent platforms because the operators constantly create new ones to replace those that have been identified. And the database maintenance requires continuous input from people currently experiencing active scam contact. The people best positioned to provide that intelligence are recent victims who recognize the scam mid-conversation and disengaged. People whose lived experience of the current operational template is more current than anything available to law enforcement through official channels. There is something worth pausing on in this dynamic. The community of people who were harmed by pig butchering has become one of the most effective resources for preventing future harm. The knowledge extracted from the experience of loss has been converted through the organizational effort of people who had every reason to simply try to forget what happened into a protective resource for strangers they will never meet. This is not nothing. In a fraud ecosystem that runs on hopelessness and scale, it represents a persistent counterpressure that operates at exactly the human level the fraud operates at. Pig butchering emerged in a period when the technological tools available to scammers were dramatically expanding, and in 2024 and 2025, those tools expanded further in ways that changed the threat substantially. For the first several years of the fraud, the human element was both the core strength and the principal limitation of the model. Building a convincing relationship required a human being, articulate, patient, culturally fluent, capable of responding naturally to unexpected conversational turns. This limited the scale of any individual operator's capacity and created quality control challenges across large workforces. Generative artificial intelligence changed this calculation significantly. Large language models capable of sustaining fluid, contextually appropriate conversation in multiple languages, adapted to the tone and style preferences of particular targets based on their communication history, made it possible for a single operator to manage many more targets simultaneously, and made it possible to run operations that no longer depended on human quality conversational ability at every interaction. The minimum viable scam operator became less skilled. The ceiling on the number of simultaneous relationships any operation could maintain rose substantially. Deepfake technology addressed the video dimension of the problem. Sophisticated targets who demanded video calls as verification that their new friend was real could previously expose the fraud by forcing a live interaction that no photograph-based persona could sustain. Deepfake video generation, capable of producing real-time video of a fabricated person conducting a plausible conversation, has been reported in pig butchering cases since 2023 and is expected to become more prevalent and more convincing as the technology continues to improve. Voice synthesis tools closed the audio channel similarly. A target who called a phone number, expecting to hear the voice of the person they had been texting for months, might instead encounter a voice generated from a text-to-speech model trained to sound like the photographs suggested their friend would sound. These components combined create a fraud that can pass casual scrutiny in every dimension, visual, audio, conversational, that a target is likely to apply. The implications for the future of pig butchering as a criminal enterprise are not optimistic. The human capital requirements that limited the scale and quality of operations are being systematically removed by technology that costs almost nothing per interaction. The geographic concentration in Southeast Asian compounds may disperse as AI-assisted operations can be run by far smaller teams from far less fortified locations. The victims of trafficking may become fewer as the need for human operators decreases, which is in a narrow sense a humanitarian improvement, while the number of fraud victims expands considerably. The commoditization of the fraud kit is perhaps the most consequential development underway. In the early years of pig butchering, the operational complexity, building fake platforms, managing teams of operators, maintaining personas across extended conversations, running money laundering infrastructure, created a significant barrier to entry. Only well-capitalized, organizationally sophisticated criminal enterprises could run it at scale. By 2024, the component parts of the fraud had become available as commercial services. Fraudulent trading platform templates could be licensed from software providers who marketed them, with a studied ambiguity about their intended use as investment platform software. Operator training materials were available as downloadable packages. Persona management tools, applications for maintaining multiple fake social media identities with consistent photograph portfolios and communication histories, were advertised on dark web markets alongside more conventional cybercriminal tools. This commoditization means that pig butchering is no longer exclusively the domain of large, vertically integrated criminal operations. Individuals and small groups with modest technical capacity can assemble the components needed to run a version of the scam, and many have. The FBI has documented cases in which domestic criminal groups with no connection to Southeast Asian compound operations have run pig butchering variants, using freely available AI tools for the relationship building phase and template platforms for the fake exchange interface. The returns available from even a small operation, a few victims per month, tens of thousands of dollars each, exceed by orders of magnitude what the same effort would produce in most conventional criminal enterprises. The encryption of communication channels has made early detection harder. When pig butchering was primarily conducted through platforms with some degree of corporate oversight, WhatsApp, Instagram, there was at least a theoretical possibility of platform-level detection and intervention. As the fraud migrated toward end-to-end encrypted messaging applications and toward platforms that explicitly market their resistance to cooperation with law enforcement, that theoretical possibility closed. The conversation in which a person's relationship with a fraudulent operator develops now happens in a space that no one except the two parties can access in real time, which is, of course, also one of the features that makes it feel like a genuine private relationship. The honest answer about what can be done about pig butchering is that the problem does not have a solution available at the scale of the challenge. What exists is a set of partial responses, each meaningful at the margin, none capable of addressing the fundamental conditions that make this fraud possible. The geopolitical dimension constrains every other dimension. The compounds exist where they exist, not because of operational convenience, but because of deliberate political geography. Addressing them requires engagement with the Myanmar junta, an internationally sanctioned government that the democratic world has largely chosen to isolate rather than engage, and with Cambodian and Laotian governments whose cooperation has historically been available only when the reputational cost of inaction exceeded the economic benefit of tolerance. China's role is central and ambiguous. Beijing has publicly condemned the trafficking and has conducted some operations to repatriate Chinese workers from compounds, but the criminal networks responsible for building the compound infrastructure have historically been tolerated in overseas operations in ways that networks operating domestically would not be. How much of this tolerance reflects active protection versus bureaucratic indifference versus genuine limited reach is a question that intelligence analysts disagree on. What is not disputed is that without some form of Chinese government engagement with the Chinese criminal networks that provide the organizational and financial backbone of the largest operations, the problem cannot be resolved. The most immediate protective measure is awareness. The pig butchering scam works, in large part, because its targets do not know it exists and therefore do not recognize its precise patterns when they encounter them. The combination of unexpected contact, sustained relationship building, and introduction of an investment opportunity is distinctive enough that people who know the template can identify it when they are in it. Public awareness campaigns by law enforcement, financial institutions, and civil society organizations have demonstrably reached some people who have recognized and avoided the scam. The problem is that awareness campaigns struggle to reach people in the vulnerable states, loneliness, financial stress, recent loss, that make them most susceptible to the relationship dimension of the fraud. Regulatory pressure on cryptocurrency platforms has produced some progress. The major exchanges, Coinbase, Binance, Kraken, have invested in compliance systems that detect patterns associated with pig butchering proceeds and freeze suspicious transactions. The Tron Foundation and Tether have developed more robust responses to law enforcement freeze requests. These measures are not close to sufficient, but they are not nothing. The trafficking dimension requires a different response. Political pressure on the governments of Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos that have either enabled or tolerated the compounds. International diplomatic frameworks that make it costly for these governments to provide safe harbor to criminal operations, and targeted sanctions against the concrete Chinese organized crime networks whose capital built the compound infrastructure. The United States has imposed some targeted sanctions in this space. Their effect has been limited by the complexity of the networks, the availability of alternative financial channels, and the limited leverage available against Myanmar in particular, where the military junta that staged the 2021 coup has neither the capacity nor the incentive to address the compound problem. For the people who have already been victimized, the most valuable resources are the survivor communities and advocacy organizations that have emerged over the past several years. These organizations provide information about what happened, validation of the experience, and sometimes precise intelligence that can be shared with law enforcement. Recovering money that has moved through cryptocurrency mixing services and been extracted through offshore exchanges is, in most cases, not possible. But understanding what happened and why is itself a form of recovery that matters. Financial institutions have a role to play that most have not yet fully inhabited. The wire transfers and cryptocurrency purchases that fund pig butchering accounts pass through regulated financial systems, and the patterns associated with pig butchering fund flows, large transfers to cryptocurrency exchanges by individuals with no documented trading history, followed by rapid international movement, are recognizable to systems with the data and the will to look for them. Several major banks have implemented customer intervention protocols that trigger when these patterns are detected, prompting a conversation with the account holder before the transfer is processed. These interventions have demonstrably stopped some transactions mid-scam. They are not standard practice across the industry. The technology companies whose platforms are used for initial contact bear responsibility for a portion of this problem that they have been slow to acknowledge. WhatsApp, Telegram, and various dating applications are the primary vectors through which initial contact is made, and each of them has received systematic reports of scam accounts operating through their platforms. The removal of reported accounts is inconsistent, The detection of new accounts created by the same operators is technically difficult, but not impossible, and the commercial incentives that drive user growth metrics have historically worked against aggressive enforcement. Pressure from regulators and advocacy organizations has produced more responsive policies than existed several years ago, but the gap between policy and consistent implementation remains wide. For individuals, the most effective protection remains pattern recognition. The combination, unexpected contact from a stranger, sustained relationship development over weeks, and eventual introduction to an investment opportunity, is not how legitimate investment opportunities are discovered. No amount of apparent chemistry, apparent sophistication, or apparent financial proof changes this fundamental pattern. If someone you met unexpectedly through an unsolicited message, who built a relationship with you over months, introduces you to an investment platform, the platform is fraudulent. This is not a probabilistic assessment. It is, in the current environment, a near certainty. The relationship was built to deliver you to the platform. The platform exists to take your money. Understanding this at the first introduction of the investment theme, rather than at the moment of the third or fourth escalating fee request, is the difference between an uncomfortable realization and a financial catastrophe. Close your eyes again if they have drifted open in the dark. Somewhere in the world tonight, in a compound behind a wall in a borderland that exists outside the reach of any law, there are people conducting conversations that feel to the people receiving them like the beginning of something real. The conversations are patient and skilled and attuned to everything that makes the other person feel seen and understood. The feeling is not entirely false. The attention is genuine. The skill is real. The warmth in the messages is the product of human beings doing their best work. What is false is the framework, the purpose, the identity, the platform, the future. And somewhere else in the world tonight, receiving those messages, are people who have been lonely or recently hurt, or simply open to the possibility that something unexpected and good might come from a conversation with a stranger. They have no reason yet to be afraid. They are in this moment still safe. If you know them, or if you recognize yourself in this description, the most important thing you can learn is what this pattern looks like from the inside, so that when you feel it, you know to pause. The feeling of connection is real. The source of it may not be. Let the weight of this settle gently now. Let the complexity and the sorrow of it rest without requiring resolution tonight. Some problems are too large for any single night's accounting. You are safe. You are still. The world is complicated, and the people in it are doing their best, most of them, in circumstances you cannot always see. Rest. Story end.